All right, so welcome to part two. So in the last one, we got it set up where our players start on the correct side of the board or the level. So I think next, let's make it so that we have, so let me just press play on my other project real quick. So if you notice up here at the top, we have a nice little message that says it's your turn or it says waiting. So that way you know if it's your turn or you're waiting. And you can fly around regardless if it's your turn or not. We'll do the flying around controls later, but I think let's first make it so that we know whose turn it is, and then we'll just make it something simple where like if you left click, it switches to the other person's turn, and like the server kind of tells the other person, hey, it's your turn, and it tells you, hey, it's no longer your turn. So let's do that first because that's sort of the fundamental of things, and that way if you want to stop after you get there, you can. You don't have to watch the rest. So um, let's see here. All right, so let's actually start in our game mode here. So the first thing I want to do is we want to override the on post login event. So if we hit overrides here, we should be able to find a on post login. So this event gets called, like it says, when the player has successfully logged in and has been given a player controller. And the reason we're overriding this is because we want to wait to start the game until we have two people connected. And then because we don't want to start before that because obviously you don't want to play with nobody else on the other team. So what we can say here is we can use that handy little get num players function. We can hook this up, and so we can say if this value equals 2, so we'll say equals 2, then we know we can go ahead and start the game. So we'll do a branch here, and then if it's true, we want to start the game. So I'm going to make a little event down here and just call it start game. So add custom event, and then we'll call it start game. And from here, we will just call start game. Start game. And one thing to mention here, if you guys are totally new to networking, you might not know this, but the game mode, which we're inside of right now, this only exists on the server. It doesn't even exist at all on the clients. So any code we write in here is only running on the server. So it's kind of something to keep in mind. So it's really the server that's doing this check to figure out if there's two players connected, because it doesn't really make sense for the client to do it, right? Like the client shouldn't be able to start the game. Only the server should be able to do that. So all this code is running on the server. We don't have to do any special checks here to make sure we're on the server or anything like that, because the game mode, like this file, this class, literally only exists on the server. All right, so we call start game. So when the game starts, we basically want to start the turn of the first player. So we're going to make a couple functions here to handle this. So let's make a, let's see here. Actually, let's make a macro to figure out whose turn it is. So the reason I'm using a macro here, you could use a function, but I usually just use macros whenever it's a function that is essentially a private function, like nobody else is going to call from outside the class, and also whenever it's something very simple. So for that reason, I'm going to use macro. Again, you could use a function for these, but I'm just going to stick with macro. So I'm just going to call this macro player in turn. And this is going to return the player that is currently in his turn, if that makes sense. And then we're also going to make another one called player not in turn. So if we go back to player in turn, what we want to do is we want to know which player is the current player in turn, right? Because the server is going to be keeping track of this. It's going to have a variable, and that variable is either going to be set to 0 or it's going to be set to 1, depending on whose turn it is. So over here on the left, let's pick a variable, and we'll call it current player's turn, and we will make it private. And then inside of here, what we can do is we can drag in this current player's turn. Oh, make sure we change this. We don't want this to be a map. We want to be single. Make sure we make this single. So single, integer, private. Okay. We want to drag this guy in, say get. And off of this, we can say get player controller. So get player controller is just an engine function, and it takes in the player index. So it's exactly what we want. And then we want to cast this to our turn based player controller, because remember, we changed the player controller, we overrode it to be our custom one, and this will be important later. And then you can actually take this and convert it to a pure cast, and that will get rid of the little execution pin, so that way we can just hook it up like this. And then this is just a really long, ugly name, so I'm just going to rename this to player controller, just make it a little neater. And then we sort of want to do the same thing, but, well, the opposite inside of the other ones. Let's go to player not in turn. And so for this one, we want to return the other player. So again, we're going to drag in the current player controller, and then we want to, so if this is 0, right, if it's currently player 0's turn, we want to return 1. And if it's currently player 1 turn, we want to return 0. So we want to do the opposite. So I'm going to drag off this and say equals. So if it equals 0, then we're going to do a select node off of that. Select, and make sure you select the yellow node, or the yellow icon select. That's the like generic one that we want. And then, so like we're saying, if it's 0, we want to select 1. So actually, we need to write get player controller first. And then if we hook this right side of the get player controller node up to the left side of the select, you can see it now knows what these are supposed to be. And so we want to set the true to be 1, and the false, we want to keep it as 0. So if you don't know what this is, I'll just try to explain it real quick. So this is just very simple logic. I know it might look a little confusing if you've never used this before, but it's just saying if the current player's turn is 0, then return 1. And if it's not 0, return 0. So that's basically flipping this value. If it's 0, it's going to return 1. If it's 1, it's going to return 0. And then from here, we just do the same thing. We want to take this guy and say cast to turn-based player controller. Right-click, convert to pure cast again, and return this guy. And then rename it to player controller. All right. So now, back here, let's go back to our event graph. One thing you'll notice here, just worth pointing out, so if you click on this guy and you've compiled it, the current player's turn by default is going to be 0, which is exactly what we want, so make sure you leave this as 0. And then what we want to do is we want to drag our player in turn, so when the game starts, we want to tell the player whose turn it is that it is his turn. So to do that, we need to call into the player controller, because we have a reference of it right here. This is the guy's whose turn it is, but we need to actually tell him that it's his turn. So to do that, we need to go inside of our player controller, and we need to go to our event graph, and we want to make some functions in here. So I'm just going to delete these for right now because we don't need them. We want to make a function in here called, or actually we want to say add custom event first of all, and then we're going to call it start turn, and then this is going to be a function that runs on the client. So I'm going to write in all caps afterwards, client. You don't have to write client afterwards, just FYI. This is just something I like to do whenever I have a function that's going to be running on the client. I like to end it with client in all uppercase, just so it's very easy to tell. And then on the right, we want to set the replicated mode to run on owning client, and we want to set it to reliable. So if you don't know what reliable does, it basically, it does exactly what it sounds like. It makes it so there's this, because this is a network message that's going from the server to the client. If you have reliable checked, it's guaranteed that the message will get through. If you don't have it checked, it's not guaranteed. So you might be thinking, okay, well, why don't we always just make it reliable? Well, the reason you don't want to always make things reliable is because it's a lot more expensive in terms of networking. In many cases, you don't care if something fails necessarily. Like if you just play a particle effect or a sound, you're not going to care if that fails. It's not the end of the world. Obviously, it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. And that's sort of the idea. If it's something that can happen, that's not going to ruin the game permanently, you generally want to make it unreliable. But if it's something that, if this doesn't run, the rest of the course of the game will no longer work, or the game will become like extremely broken in some state, you want to set it to reliable. So obviously this needs to be reliable, because if we miss this, then we'll miss the message that it's our turn, and the game will just never progress because we'll never get to play out our turn. So hopefully that makes sense. So this is called start turn client, and we also want one for ending the turn while we're here. So we're going to say add custom event, and we'll call it end turn, and then again screaming uppercase client, and then make sure again you set this to run on owning client and reliable. So now that we have these, we can come back here to our turn-based game mode, and we can drag off this guy, and we can say start, what is it called? Start, why is this not showing up? Oh, because I'm stupid. I accidentally put these inside of the player start, not the player controller. So sorry. Just copy or take both of these guys and just cut them, like Control X, cut them. And actually, we can just close this turn-based player start so I don't actually make that mistake again because we don't need it. We want to come into our player controller. So come back to the core folder and find the turn-based player controller. Here is where we want to do this in the event graph of this. So let's delete this stuff because we don't need it, and then paste. I think it copies over everything correctly. So yeah, so it still should be called start turn client and run on client reliable, and same with this one. Okay, sorry about that. So now we can go back to our game mode. We can drag off of this. So we can say start turn client, and there it goes. Now it shows up. So we want to do that inside of here for the start game, and then we'll do the end game here in a second. But just to kind of explain what's going on here. So again, we're on the game modes. This is on the server. And so the server is basically telling the client that it's your turn. And so that he knows that he can actually click on actors now and he can do stuff that now it's his turn. So let's go back to here. So we just wanted to hook this up. Go back to our turn-based player controller. And let's write some very simple logic here. So when we get the message from the server that it's our turn, we want to save that into a Boolean so that we know it's our turn. So we're going to make a variable over here, and we'll just call it my turn, question mark. And again, we can make this private. And we could just set this to true right here, right? This would make sense. But in order to get the HUD to work, which is the thing that shows if it's your turn or not on the screen at the top, we want to actually dispatch an event whenever this happens. So because of that, I'm going to put this inside of a function. So I'm going to delete this real quick, and we're just going to make a function over here, and we're going to call it set my turn, and we'll make it private. And then inside of here, we'll take in a Boolean for whether or not it is my turn. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set it to whatever is passed in. But now we also want to dispatch an event dispatcher. And the reason we're going to do this is, like I said, the HUD, which is the thing that shows you whether or not it's your turn, is going to be bound to this event. So when your turn changes, let's say it becomes your turn, the HUD can update and say at the top, like, it is your turn, or it can change the UI around, or it can do whatever your game needs to do when it becomes your turn. And then when it stops being your turn, it will also get notified, so it can hide something, or it can say something different, or whatever you want to do. And so to do that, we need to create an event dispatcher. So over here, we have event dispatchers. We're going to create this, and we're going to call it on my turn changed. All right. And then we want to take in a variable. So if we click on this up here, we can have this take in a new parameter, and we will call this, again, my turn. And then let's compile, save, and then we should be able to just drag this guy in and say call. And we can hook this up like this, and we can hook this up like so. So all this is doing is it's just setting our variable to whatever gets passed in, and then it's dispatching the event with the new value. So if we come up here to our event graph, now we can very simply just say set my turn. And since this is start turn, we'll set it to true. And then for end turn, you can probably guess what we're going to do. We're going to copy and paste this, and we are going to uncheck this because it is no longer my turn, right? So hopefully that makes sense. The next thing we want to do, let's see here, actually. Yeah, so let's make it for right now. Let's make it so if you just left click as the client, it ends your turn. Like that's performing your action. And then later on, we can expand on it so you can actually click on characters and all that good stuff. So let's right click and let's search for the left mouse button event. So this just gets called when the left mouse button is pressed. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to check whether or not it is my turn. And this code is going to be running locally because whenever you have input, it runs locally. It's not running on the server because it's you left click the mouse on your computer and this code gets ran on your computer right there. It's not something that's running on the server. So just FYI. So let's just make a little function over here again for handling this left mouse click. So I'm going to make a function and we're going to call it handle left mouse button, and we can make this private. And then back here, we will just call this guy like So when they press the left mouse button, we just make sure it's their turn, and then we handle this however we want. So like I said, let's just make this function very simple for right now. And all we want to do is we basically want to end our turn. Um, so to end our turn, we basically need to tell the server that our turn is over. But we don't really want the client to be able to do that because it's really not safe to be able to have the client figure out when his turn is over. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make some events like move or attack or whatever like actions your character can perform. We're going to make events for those on the server, and then the client, if the client decides he wants to attack somebody or he wants to walk, he's going to tell the server, hey, please go ahead and attack, or please go ahead and walk, and then the server will do that action, and then the server will end that player's turn for him. So we'll come back to this here in a second, but in the event graph of our player controller, our player controller, we want to add those action events. So any type of event you want to have in your game that uses up like a turn for the player. So if the player has like 5 action points or whatever, like he can move or he can attack or he can heal or he can whatever, you want to make a event for that. So let's just start with we're going to make a move one for right now. It's not actually going to move him yet, but we're going to pretend like it is and just end his turn. So right here, we're going to say add custom event, and we're going to call it server action. And then I'm going to make like a dash here and say move hero. And so the idea here is that, or actually, sorry, let's make this again run on server, because this is going from the client to the server, whereas these were going from the server to the client. That's why they're called client. So this one's going from the server, from the client to the server. So we say run on server. We want to make it reliable. And the idea here, just so you guys can kind of see where I'm going with this, is that if you want to have another one, you could just copy paste this, call it server action attack hero. And then you would set it to server and reliable. And you could keep doing this for whatever types of things you wanted, like healing or any other action you wanted in your game. You could do this and then just kind of follow the same pattern that we're about to do. So normally, or in a little bit, we'll have the move code here once we get our players in. But for right now, what we want to do is we just want to tell the server that it's basically like our turn has ended. So if you had action points, I just kind of want to point this out because I know a lot of you are probably thinking this. If you had something in your game where like the character could only move 3 times, or he could perform 3 actions, whatever those were, this is where you would write that code where you would decrement it. So you basically have a variable over here called action points, and then you would decrease it right here because this is on the server, right? So you decrease it right here, and then you check if it's 0, and if it's 0, meaning there's no action points left, then you would write the code we're about to do to end the turn. But for the simplicity of this tutorial, I'm just going to make it so that as soon as you do one action, your turn ends. Okay, so to end the turn, we need to have some sort of function inside of our game mode. So we'll come back to this in a second. So back in our game mode, let's make a function right here, or sorry, an event right here. So add custom event. We will call this cycle turns. So cycle turns is basically going to switch whose turn it is. So if it's player 0's turn, it's going to switch it to player 1, and vice versa, right? So to do that, thankfully we have these handy little macros here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to end the turn of the current player. So the player who's currently in turn, we want to drag off this, and we want to say end turn on the client, which is that function we just wrote, like so. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to switch whose turn it is. So this current player's turn, we want to switch this. So let's drag this in. And we're going to do something very similar to what we did before with the select. So we're going to check if it equals 0. If it does, we'll do a select node. Or, well, regardless of if it equals 0, we're going to do a select node. And then we want to set it to the opposite. So we'll drag this in again. Say set, hook this guy up, hook up our execution pen. So now we just have to write this little logic here. So if current player's turn equals 0, then we want to switch it to 1. Otherwise, we want to leave it as 0, right? So I will switch it. And then once that is switched, now we can say player in turn, which is going to be the new player, right? We want to say start turn client. Now that I think about it, I don't think we actually are using this macro for anything. I think I made this thinking we were going to use it, but we actually are not using it. So you can delete it, or maybe you might want to use it in your game if you need access to it for some other reason. You can keep it. But I just realized I don't think we're actually using this macro. So don't get confused by that. I think I just made a mistake and created it, but we don't actually need it. But it could be useful later, so I'm going to keep it. Okay, so this is cycling the turns. It ends the current player's turn, it switches the current player, and then it starts that new current player's turn, right? So hopefully that makes sense. So now back in our turn-based player controller, inside of our server action events, what we want to do here is we want to get our game mode. So right click and say get game mode. And we want to cast this, because right now this is just a game mode base. We want to cast this to our turn-based game mode. And we want to call cycle turns, like so. And then obviously you'd want to do the exact same thing in all of your other actions after you do whatever specific thing you want that action to do. So again, we'll come back and we'll fill out these a little bit more later to make it like a little better example. But for right now, like I said, we're just gonna make it so you left click, we handle the left mouse click button. And so inside of handle left mouse click button, we want to call our server action. So inside of here, depending on what you're doing, left click might do a different thing, right? Because if you left click on your character and then you left click on the terrain, you're going to want them to move, right? But if you left click on your character and then you select an enemy, you want him to attack. So this is where the logic is going to lie for what we want to do, and we will write this here in a little bit. But like I said, for right now, we're just going to assume that we just want to attack. So, or we just want to move, rather. So we're just going to call our server action move, or whichever one, it doesn't really matter for right now. And that's going to come out here. It's going to cycle and end our turn, which will eventually call this guy, which will stop our turn. So theoretically, this all should be working now, as far as having the server managing whose turn it is. However, we don't have any visual indication of it right now, so it's going to be really hard to tell. So for that, let's just go ahead and create a very simple widget like I did in my other project, where it has either waiting or your turn at the top. So to do that, let's see, where did I do that in my other project? Yes, so let's go back to the content folder, and then we'll right click here, we'll make a new folder, and we'll call it gameplay. And so inside of here, we're going to be adding more stuff later, like our characters and whatnot. But for right now, let's just add this HUD widget. So right click, go to blueprints, or sorry, no, it's under user interfaces, and we want widget blueprint. We're going to call this HUD underscore widget. All right, so let's open this guy up. So the first thing I want to do, make sure you're on the designer tab up here at the top left, or sorry, the top right. The first thing we want to do is we want to add a border to the top. This will just give it a nice little backdrop. And then we want to set this anchor to anchor the full top right, or top middle. And then once we do that, we need to clear out the offset right. And then for the size wide, we can set it something maybe a little bigger, like 60, just so we have a little bit more room. And then for the brush color, I'm just going to set it to some darkish color like this. Sure, that's amazing. And then inside of here, we want to add some text, which is either going to say waiting or your turn, so you know if it's your turn or not. So up here, let's just drag in a text onto the border. And then let's take this text and we're going to set it to center. And then by default, we're just going to say waiting. All right, so obviously we want to take this text and we want to bind it to that event dispatcher. Because if you remember, inside of our player controller, we made this on my turn change event dispatcher, which gets dispatched whenever the player's turn changes. So the idea is we're going to bind this text, or well, we're gonna make it so that whenever that event dispatcher gets dispatched, we're going to update this text depending on whether or not it's our turn. So to do that, we need to write that code inside the graph. But again, we want to have access to this text. So for that reason, we need to make it a variable so we can actually access it from the graph tab. So we can just select is variable up here with the text selected. And then we can give it a better name than text blocks 79. We'll just call it the turn text, for example. And so now, if we go back to the graph tab, you can see on the left here, we have our variable turn text. So this turn text is referring to this text up here. Okay, so like I said, we want to bind to this event dispatcher. So in order to bind to it, it's inside of our player controller, which that means we need a reference to our player controller in order to bind to it. So we really only want let's just delete all these. So we want, actually we do want that one. We want construct, the event construct. Where is it? Event construct. And we also want event destruct. The idea is that when this widget gets constructed, we're going to bind to it, and when it gets destructed, we're going to unbind to it, or unbind from it, maybe. So right click and say get owning player. So the owning player is the player controller, which owns this widget, which is exactly what we want, because that's the guy that has the event dispatcher. Except we need to cast it to our turn-based one, so we'll say cast to turn-based player controller. And then from there, we can bind to this event dispatcher. So we can say bind to on my turn changed. And then we can drag off this and say add custom event. And we will say on my turn changed. Okay, so the idea, if you never used event dispatchers before, is that whenever this event dispatcher gets dispatched from right here, when we call it, it's going to call this event. And before we write this event, let's just go ahead and write the destruct code to unbind from it. So we can actually just copy these two nodes and drag off this and say unbind event on my turn change. Make sure you do unbind event and not unbind all events, because that will unbind all of them, which we obviously don't want. And then we can just also hook this up to the same node. So we're just binding to it when it gets created and unbinding to it when it gets destructed. Okay, so now inside of here, all we need to do is we need to change this text to say whatever we want it to say. So we drag off the my turn boolean and use our favorite node, the select. And then we can drag in our text, say get, and then we drag off this and say set the actual text of the text block. And we can hook this up. And if we hook this up to here, you'll see our select node updates. And now we can just type whatever we want inside of this node. So if it's my turn is true, it's going to say whatever we put here. So we'll just say your turn, or you can write whatever you want when it's your turn. And then false, we're just going to keep it as waiting. All right, very good. So now the last thing we need to do for this section of the tutorial is we need to take this widget and add it to the screen so the player can actually see it. So back in our turn-based player controller, let's go to our event graph here, and then we're going to do this in begin play. So as soon as it gets created, we want to add this widget to the screen. So right-click and say event begin play, and we want to first and foremost check if this player controller is a local controller. So I'm going to write this real quick and then I'll explain it in case you're confused. So you want to right click and say is local controller. And then we want to do a branch. Put it up like so. And then we want to right click and say create create widget. And the widget we want to create is obviously our HUD widget. And then make sure you pass in the owning player, which is going to be self. So we'll just say get ref to self, because we are the ones that own it. And then we can just say add to viewport. All right, so let me just explain this check right here in case you don't know what this is doing. So something is considered locally controlled if it's being controlled. Well, maybe I can just give you an example. So if you're playing Fortnite, right? When you launch up the game and you join a match and you start walking around, right, with the keyboard and the mouse or the controller or whatever, on your computer, that player that you're possessing, like your character with the pickaxe and all that good stuff, he is locally controlled on your machine because you are controlling him locally, right? That makes sense. But on the server also has a copy of your character that's walking around, but the server is not locally controlling him, right? You are locally controlling him on your computer, and everybody else in the game is locally controlling their character on their own computer. So it's basically checking, is this being controlled by a human, like on the instance of the computer that it's running on, if that makes sense. It doesn't necessarily mean is it not on the server, because you could be running as a listen server. And if you remember, a listen server is a server that's also has a client on it. So if you're running this on a listen server, this is going to return true even though you're on the server, but only for your character, if that makes sense. And the reason we're checking this is because, like, obviously your HUD only needs to show up on your computer. Like, other players in the match don't want to see your HUD. The server doesn't want to see your HUD. And that's actually what these little icons mean. These little computer icons mean that if you call this node or this node, they're only going to really do anything um, if you're on a locally controlled like character or locally controlled controller. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's go ahead and run this, and hopefully I didn't break anything. So let's go ahead and hit play up the top. Okay, so that seems like maybe it's working. So we see your turn for the server, and we see waiting for the client. We need to fix this mouse issue because it's not great right now. We'll fix that later. But if I can manage to click on the right side here. So if I click on the right, you can see now the right side says waiting, and the left side says your turn. If I try to click again on the right, nothing happens. If I try to click on the left, you can see it just infinitely switches back and forth. So this is like the very fundamental setup for a turn-based game. And so from here on out in the tutorial, we're basically just going to be adding characters, being able to move. We're going to be fixing the camera so you can fly around. So if this is as much as you need to know, then feel free to give me a like and stop watching the tutorial. But if you want to see like a little bit more in depth, more specifically how you would use this with characters and stuff, then feel free to stick around for the next part. We'll be setting up characters where you can actually select them and then select where you want them to move to or select who you want them to attack and all that good stuff. So I'll see you guys in the next video.